The man in the aisle didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. "Sir, you're going to have to step off the aircraft." The words landed hard anyway, like a door slammed inches from someone's face. For a moment, no one moved. The cabin of the wide body jet sat frozen in that strange, pressurized quiet, where even breathing sounds loud. Overhead, bins hummed softly. Somewhere near the front, a glass clinked against another glass. A woman gasped and then covered her mouth as if embarrassed by the sound she'd made. The man being addressed remained seated. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his back straight against the cream-colored leather of the VIP seat. His hands rested calmly on the armrests. Fingers relaxed, not gripping, not shaking. He wore a dark charcoal jacket, no tie. A plain white shirt beneath. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed money. His hair was cropped short and grey at the temples, his face lined in a way that spoke of years lived under weight rather than ease. His name was Thomas Reed, 61 years old, and every person in that cabin was already certain he did not belong where he was sitting. The airline supervisor stood in the aisle beside him, posture rigid, one hand hovering near the seat back, as if ready to guide or push depending on what came next. Behind the supervisor, 2 flight attendants waited, their smiles long gone, replaced by that careful neutrality people adopt when they know something has gone wrong, but don't yet know how badly. "Is there a problem?" Thomas asked. His voice was calm, low, controlled. The kind of voice that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. The supervisor swallowed. He glanced briefly toward the front of the cabin, then back down at Thomas. "We've received a complaint, a seating concern." Thomas tilted his head slightly. Not confused. Curious. Like a man listening to a story he already knew the ending of. Across the aisle, a white man in his late 60s sat stiffly in his seat, chin lifted, jaw tight. His blazer was navy, the kind that came with brass buttons. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He stared straight ahead, pretending he wasn't watching. Pretending this had nothing to do with him. But his knee bounced just once before he forced it still. Thomas noticed. He noticed everything. The supervisor continued, voice lowering, as if discretion could soften what he was about to say. "Another passenger doesn't feel comfortable with you sitting in this section." There it was. The sentence dressed up in courtesy. The old American sentence that had been used in restaurants, neighborhoods, offices, and schools for generations. Polite, vague, devastating. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Not outrage. Not yet. Just discomfort. The kind people feel when they recognize injustice, but hope it won't ask anything of them. Thomas breathed in slowly through his nose. The smell of leather, recycled air, and citrus cleanser filled his chest. He had smelled this exact combination before, years ago. On another flight, another seat. Another moment when someone had decided his presence was negotiable. "Did I violate a policy?" he asked. "No, sir." "Am I being disruptive?" "No, sir." "Then what exactly is the concern?" The supervisor hesitated. That hesitation stretched thin and fragile, and in it lived the truth no one wanted to say out loud. A few rows back, an older woman with silver hair and a cane tightened her grip on the armrest. She'd lived long enough to recognize this pause, long enough to know what came after. The supervisor cleared his throat. For the sake of the overall cabin experience, we're asking you to relocate to another seat. Thomas's eyes flicked toward the window. The tarmac lights blurred slightly against the glass. Outside, ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, unaware that inside the aircraft, a familiar American ritual was unfolding. Which seat? Thomas asked. Toward the rear of the cabin, the supervisor said, "You'll be compensated." Compensated. The word landed like an insult wrapped in a coupon. The man in the navy blazer exhaled relief slipping through despite his attempt to remain composed. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, quickly suppressed. He told himself this wasn't personal. Told himself this was about comfort standards order. He had flown this airline for decades. He knew how things were supposed to work. Across the aisle, a younger man, maybe late 40s, dressed in khakis and a windbreaker, shifted uncomfortably. He looked from Thomas to the supervisor and back again, his brow furrowing. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes dropped to his phone. Silence was easier. Silence was safer. Thomas felt it. The weight of that silence. He always did. He thought of his father, long gone now, who used to say that America didn't always shout when it pushed you aside. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it smiled, sometimes it asked nicely and waited to see if you'd cooperate. Thomas looked back at the supervisor. Who made the complaint? The supervisor stiffened. I can't disclose that. Thomas nodded once. But I think we both know. The supervisor didn't respond. His eyes flicked just for a second toward the man in the blazer. It was enough. Thomas leaned back slightly, the leather creaking beneath him. He could feel the eyes on him now. Some curious, some sympathetic, some impatient. Everyone wanted this resolved quickly. Everyone wanted their flight to leave on time. Justice was always inconvenient when it threatened the schedule. Let me understand something, Thomas said. You're asking me to give up a seat I paid for because someone else doesn't like the way I look sitting in it. The supervisor's jaw tightened. Sir, is that not what's happening? A flight attendant shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her name badge read, Emily. She was in her early 30s, hair pulled back too tightly, eyes darting between her supervisor and Thomas. Her lips pressed together, a flicker of something like shame passing across her face before she smoothed it away. The man in the blazer finally turned. Now hold on, he said, his tone genial, practiced. Nobody's saying anything like that. We're just trying to keep things pleasant. No need to turn this into something it isn't. Thomas looked at him. Really looked at him. Took in the confident posture, the assumption of agreement, the expectation that his words would carry more weight simply because they always had. And what is it then? Thomas asked. The man opened his mouth, closed it. He wasn't used to being asked to explain himself. The supervisor stepped in quickly. Sir, if you refuse to comply, we'll have to escalate this. There it was. The soft threat, the uniformed authority. The implication that resistance would only make things worse. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from recognition. He had been here before. In boardrooms, in courtrooms, in quiet hallways where decisions were made about people like him, without people like him in the room. He glanced down at his hands. Steady. He liked that they were steady. Escalate, how he asked. The supervisor didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The answer was written into the structure of the situation, into the history of who was usually believed and who was usually moved. From the front of the cabin, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are just about ready for departure. Thank you for your patience." The timing felt intentional, like a reminder of where the real power sat. Thomas smiled then. Not warmly, not kindly. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, but it changed the air around him. A few passengers felt it without understanding why, a subtle shift that made their shoulders tense. "All right," Thomas said. The supervisor straightened, relief flickering across his face. "I'll move," Thomas continued. The relief spread. A problem solved. A delay avoided. Order restored. But Thomas wasn't finished. "I'll move," he said again, his voice quieter now, forcing the supervisor to lean closer, "because I want everyone here to remember this moment clearly. The words you chose, the silence you accepted, the decision you made so you could feel comfortable for a few hours." The supervisor frowned. "Sir, this isn't about a seat," Thomas said. "And it's not over when I stand up." For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed the supervisor's face. The man in the blazer shifted again, a prickle of unease creeping in where confidence had been. Thomas rose slowly, deliberately. The aisle seemed narrower as he stepped into it, his presence suddenly undeniable. Conversations had stopped completely now. Every eye followed him as he reached up, retrieved his bag, and turned toward the rear of the cabin. As he passed, the older woman with the cane met his gaze. She nodded once, a small, almost invisible gesture. Respect, recognition. Thomas nodded back. He took his new seat without complaint, buckled in, and placed his bag at his feet. Around him, the cabin exhaled tension, draining away as people convinced themselves the situation had resolved. But Thomas's eyes were already distant, focused inward, calculating. Somewhere deep beneath the calm, something had shifted. Not broken. Sharpened. The plane doors closed with a heavy thud. The engines began to hum, rising in pitch. And while the aircraft prepared to leave the ground, something else had already been set in motion. The engines spooled louder, a low mechanical growl vibrating through the floor, and Thomas Reed closed his eyes just long enough to steady his breathing. 4 seconds in. Hold. Slow release. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft, amber washing faces in a forgiving glow that made everyone look calmer than they felt. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer finally allowed himself to relax. His shoulders dropped, his hands unclenched. He leaned back, signaling to the flight attendant with a familiar flick of 2 fingers. Emily approached, professional smile back in place, though her eyes avoided Thomas's row. "Bourbon," the man said quietly. "Neat." "Of course, Mr. Wallace," Emily replied. The name slipped out easily. Familiar. Practiced. Thomas filed it away without looking up. The plane began to taxi. The soft bump of tires over concrete felt almost soothing, like a promise that motion itself could erase what had just happened. Several passengers returned to their screens, their books, their carefully constructed bubbles. A few glanced back toward Thomas, curiosity mixed with relief that the spotlight had moved on. It hadn't. 2 rows behind Thomas, a woman in her early 50s sat rigid, her tablet dark in her lap. She wore reading glasses on a thin chain and a wool cardigan, despite the controlled cabin temperature. Her name was Linda Parker, retired high school civics teacher. She had watched the entire exchange with a tightness in her chest that reminded her uncomfortably of staff meetings, where the wrong decision was always justified as the easiest one. She leaned slightly toward her husband. "That wasn't right," she murmured. He sighed, eyes still on the safety card. "I know. You could have said something." He hesitated. And then what Linda had no answer that wouldn't cost them something. She looked down, ashamed of how quickly the question had ended the conversation. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Hargreave adjusted his headset, his jaw set. 59 years old, former Air Force. 35 years of flying commercial metal across oceans and continents. He had been briefed quickly by the lead supervisor before pushback. A seating issue, handled, passenger compliant, no further action needed. He liked problems that resolved themselves. "What was that about?" asked the first officer, Jason Cole, early 30s, eyes alert, voice cautious. Hargreave shrugged. "Customer comfort issue. Happens all the time." Jason glanced back through the open cockpit door before it sealed shut. He had caught a glimpse of Thomas standing in the aisle earlier. Calm, unmoving. Not the posture of a troublemaker. Something about it had stuck with him. "Did we do the right thing?" Jason asked. Hargreave didn't look at him. "We did what keeps the flight on schedule." The cockpit door closed with a soft click. Conversation over. Thomas stared at the seat back in front of him, its plastic scuffed by years of anonymous knees. He didn't mind the seat. He minded the pattern, the predictability of it, the way everyone involved had known their roles without needing to discuss them. Emily returned with the bourbon, placing it carefully on Mr. Wallace's tray. The amber liquid caught the light, rich and warm. He smiled up at her. "Appreciate you." Emily nodded. "Let me know if you need anything else." As she turned away, her gaze flicked briefly toward Thomas. Their eyes met for half a second. Something unreadable crossed her face. Regret, maybe. Or fear. Or the uncomfortable awareness that she would remember this moment long after the flight ended. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. He didn't unlock it yet. He simply held it, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hand. Around him, the cabin settled into its rhythm. The muted clatter of glassware, the whisper of air vents, the distant whine of engines climbing toward takeoff speed. Outside, the plane paused at the end of the runway. The silence before acceleration stretched taut as a wire. Then the thrust came sudden and forceful, pressing Thomas back into his seat. The cabin tilted upward, gravity shifting the ground, falling away. A few passengers gripped armrests reflexively. Someone laughed nervously. The city lights slid beneath them, shrinking, dissolving into patterns. As the plane climbed, Thomas unlocked his phone. He didn't open email. He didn't call anyone. He opened a secure notes app protected by layers of authentication most people never thought about. His thumb moved with practiced ease, navigating folders labeled in neutral language that meant nothing to anyone else. One file sat at the top. A draft. Incomplete. Waiting. He opened it. Inside were names, dates, policy references, risk assessments, the skeleton of something much larger than a complaint. He had started it months ago, after a different incident in a different city, when a young engineer from his company had called him late at night, voice shaking, describing how he'd been escorted out of a hotel lounge because another guest felt uneasy. At the time, Thomas had listened, advised patience, promised he'd look into it. He had. Quietly. Methodically. This flight wasn't an anomaly. It was confirmation. Across the aisle, Mr. Wallace lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and exhaled with satisfaction. He leaned back, eyes closing briefly, the taste of victory lingering. To him, the situation was resolved exactly as it should have been. Standards upheld, order maintained. He told himself he wasn't prejudiced. He'd worked with all kinds of people. He just believed certain spaces functioned better when everyone felt comfortable. He didn't consider who that comfort was designed for. Jason Cole glanced back again through the cockpit door window, just for a moment before forcing his eyes forward. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been mishandled, that they had mistaken quiet compliance for resolution. "Gear up," Hargreaves said. Jason complied, hands moving automatically, but his mind stayed with the image of the man who hadn't raised his voice, who hadn't argued, who hadn't done anything that would justify being removed from his seat. In the cabin, Linda Parker finally stood gripping her cane for balance as the seatbelt sign flickered off. She made her way slowly toward the restroom, passing Thomas's row. She stopped, hesitated, then leaned slightly toward him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Thomas looked up at her. Really looked at her. The apology wasn't for him alone. It carried the weight of decades. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, eyes shining, and continued down the aisle. Emily watched the exchange from the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a napkin. She told herself she'd done what she had to do, that she had rent to pay. A kid in college, a supervisor watching her every move. But the words Thomas had spoken echoed in her head. This isn't about a seat. She wondered what it was about, then feared she already knew. Thomas returned his attention to his phone. He began typing slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The draft took shape no longer hypothetical, not angry, precise, grounded in policy language and documented behavior. A record, a case. He added the flight number, the route, the names he'd overheard. Wallace, Emily, supervisor, Captain Hargreave. He paused, then added, Jason Cole. Not as an accusation, as a witness. The plane leveled off, the sensation of climb, easing into a steady glide. Seatbelt signs chimed off. The world outside the window was dark now, punctured by stars. Thomas set the phone down on his tray table and folded his hands over it. Around him, people settled in, convinced the tension had passed, unaware that the story they thought had ended was only beginning. Somewhere between the cabin lights dimming further and the quiet rustle of blankets being unfolded, Thomas Reed made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with leverage. Not the loud kind, the kind built patiently, invisibly, until the moment it mattered. He closed his eyes again, not to rest, but to focus. The aircraft surged forward into the night, carrying with it a silence heavy enough to crack when it finally broke. The first crack came from the galley quiet, but unmistakable. The sharp sound of glass striking metal, followed by a breath caught too late. Emily froze, fingers hovering over the service cart, as a few ice cubes skittered across the floor. She crouched quickly, gathering them with shaking hands, aware of the eyes on her back, aware that her composure had slipped in a way it hadn't all evening. "Take a minute," whispered Mark. Another attendant, older, greyer, the kind of man who'd survived layoffs and mergers by never drawing attention. "I've got this." Emily nodded, embarrassed by her gratitude. She straightened, smoothing her uniform, forcing her shoulders back. Professional, neutral, safe. That word again. As she stepped away, she caught sight of Thomas through the gap between seats. He was watching the cabin with a stillness that unsettled her. Not staring, observing, like someone taking inventory. In the rear lavatory, Linda Parker stared at her reflection. The lines around her eyes looked deeper than they had that morning. She thought about her classroom, about the lessons she used to teach on civil rights, about how confident she'd sounded standing in front of students half her age. She thought about how easily she'd fallen silent when it mattered. The mirror didn't argue with her. It never did. When she returned to her seat, her husband reached for her hand. She let him hold it, but her mind stayed elsewhere, circling a question she didn't like the answer to. How many times had she told herself it wasn't her place? Up front, Mr. Wallace had finished his bourbon and was working on a second. He had loosened his collar slightly, the earlier tension dissolving into something close to contentment. He pulled out his phone, thumbs moving as he typed a message to a friend. "Routine flight hassle. Handled quickly. Good crew." He added a smiley face, then paused, deleting it. He didn't want it to seem flippant. He wanted it to sound reasonable. In the cockpit, Captain Hargreave reviewed fuel numbers, his movements efficient, practiced. Jason Cole monitored instruments, but his attention drifted again. He kept replaying the supervisor's words in his head. Seating concern. He'd heard that phrase before, too many times, each time accompanied by a quiet understanding of who was expected to move and who was not. Sir Jason said, finally keeping his tone casual, "Do we log incidents like that anywhere?" Hargreave didn't look up. "If there's a safety issue. And if it's not safety, then it's customer service." Jason nodded slowly. "Right." The answer sat poorly with him. Customer service. As if dignity were a perk, not a baseline. Thomas opened his eyes when the announcement chimed for initial service. He hadn't slept. He hadn't intended to. His mind had been working steadily, connecting dots, recalling conversations, weighing options. He watched Emily move down the aisle again, her smile back in place, though it didn't reach her eyes. When she reached his row, she hesitated. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked. "Water's fine," Thomas said. She nodded, turning away, then stopped. Her shoulders lifted with a breath. She turned back. "I'm sorry about earlier." The words came out low, rushed, almost lost to the hum of the engines. Thomas met her gaze. He didn't rescue her from the moment. He let it exist. "I know," he said. Emily blinked, surprised. "You do?" "I know why you did it," Thomas replied. "That doesn't make it right." "But I know." Her eyes glistened. She swallowed. "I didn't think it would turn into that." "It always does," Thomas said gently. Eventually. She stood there for another second, then nodded and moved on her steps, quicker now, as if distance might protect her from the weight of the exchange. Thomas accepted the water when she returned, his fingers brushing the cup. He waited until she'd passed before unlocking his phone again. New messages had arrived. Not many. Just enough. One from an old colleague now retired, whose name carried quiet respect in regulatory circles. Heard you're flying tonight. Call me when you land. Another from his assistant, sent hours earlier before boarding. Board confirmed availability for Thursday. No pressure. He typed a brief reply. Landed tomorrow. Will call. Then he opened a different app, this one even more secure. He scrolled through a list of contacts, pausing on one name. Margaret Ellis, former federal mediator, no longer officially active. Still listened to when she spoke. He didn't call her. Not yet. Across the cabin, Linda Parker watched him with a focus she hadn't intended. She recognized the posture, the stillness that wasn't submission, but preparation. She'd seen it once before, years ago, in a student who had been underestimated until the moment he stood up at a school board meeting and dismantled an argument point by point. She leaned toward her husband again. That man, she whispered. He's not done. He glanced at Thomas, then back at Linda. What makes you say that? Because he's calm, she said. Too calm. The flight settled into the long middle stretch, the hours where time softened, where people slept or pretended to. The lights dimmed further. Blankets were unfolded. The cabin breathed. Mr. Wallace dozed lightly, waking occasionally to sip his drink or glance around, reassured each time that everything was as it should be. He had not noticed the way the supervisor avoided his row now, or the way Emily's hands trembled each time she passed it. Jason Cole stared out the cockpit window at the darkness beyond. Stars scattered like careless punctuation. He thought about his daughter, about the world she would grow up in, about the lessons he wanted to pass on. He thought about the difference between following orders and doing what was right, and how often those two things diverged. Thomas finally leaned back, closing his eyes again. Not to rest, to remember. He remembered a meeting years ago, a small conference room with bad lighting, where a senior partner had smiled at him and said, "You're very articulate," as if surprised. He remembered nodding, swallowing the impulse to respond. He remembered choosing patience over confrontation, strategy over satisfaction. He had learned early that outrage spent quickly, leverage endured. When he opened his eyes, the cabin clock read 12:42 in the morning. Time enough. He pulled his phone close and began to write again, adding context, shaping narrative into something harder to dismiss. Not a rant, a record. He described the language used, the process followed, the lack of objective criteria. He noted the absence of de-escalation. He cited policy sections from memory, confident he could verify them later. He wrote until his fingers slowed, then stopped saving the draft. Around him, the plane pressed onward through the night, unaware that the quiet it carried was already fracturing, that the story everyone believed had ended in the aisle was still building momentum, gathering weight with each mile. Thomas set the phone down and folded his hands once more, the steady hum of the engines matching the rhythm of his thoughts. Somewhere far below, The ground waited. The turbulence began without warning, a sharp jolt that rattled cups and snapped heads upright, followed by the seatbelt sign, chiming back on, with an insistent ding. A few passengers muttered. One laughed nervously. The aircraft shuddered, then steadied engines, adjusting with a subtle change in pitch that travelled through the cabin like a held breath. Captain Hargreaves' voice came over the intercom, controlled, reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some rough air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Jason Cole watched the instruments settle, his fingers light on the controls. The turbulence was nothing unusual. What unsettled him was the way his pulse refused to slow. He glanced at the clock. 1:27 in the morning. Still hours to go. In the cabin, Emily pressed her palms briefly against the galley counter, grounding herself. Turbulence was familiar. What wasn't was the sensation that the ground beneath her had shifted earlier and never quite returned. She replayed the moment with Thomas again, his voice steady, not angry, not pleading. It had felt like being seen through. "Emily," Mark said softly, nodding toward the aisle. "Passenger in 10C looks anxious." She took a breath and nodded, grateful for the task. Movement helped. Routine helped. As she moved down the aisle, she passed Mr. Wallace's row. He had woken fully now, annoyance etched across his face. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered, adjusting his belt. First the delay at the gate, now this. Emily offered the practiced response. "Should smooth out soon, sir." He grunted, unsatisfied, then caught sight of Thomas, a few rows back, sitting upright, eyes open, posture unchanged. Something prickled at the back of his neck. He looked away quickly, irritated by the discomfort he couldn't quite name. Linda Parker felt the turbulence in her bones more than the seat. She closed her eyes, remembering a bus ride decades ago, marching to a rally with students who believed change came easily. She wondered what she'd taught them, really. Courage, she hoped. She wondered if she still had any left. Thomas watched the cabin react, cataloguing responses the way he always did in moments of stress. Who reached for someone else? Who pulled inward? Who complained? Who stayed quiet? He noticed Jason's voice over the intercom, calm but slightly strained. He noticed Emily's shoulders, the tension she tried to hide. He noticed Wallace's impatience curdling into something sharper. The turbulence eased. The seatbelt sign remained on. Thomas unlocked his phone again, not to write this time, but to read. A message had come through from Margaret Ellis. No subject, just a single line. "Call me now, if you can talk privately." He considered the cabin, the hum, the proximity. He typed back. "In flight. Land in the morning. Can't talk yet." 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared. Then another message. Understood. Timing matters. Keep notes. Don't send anything yet. Thomas closed the app, a faint smile touching his lips. He appreciated people who understood patience. Up front, Hargreave adjusted his seat, irritation flickering as turbulence cost them a few minutes. He prided himself on smooth flights, control, order. He didn't like variables he couldn't manage. His mind drifted unbidden to the earlier incident. He pushed the thought away. It was handled. Sir Jason said after a moment, choosing his words carefully. If there's a complaint filed later, how do we? There won't be. Hargreaves snapped, then softened his tone. Look, kid. People complain about everything. You can't let it get under your skin. Jason nodded, but the unease remained. He wondered if that advice applied when the complaint was justified. In the cabin, Emily returned to the galley, her task completed. She leaned against the counter again, breathing through her nose, counting silently. Mark watched her concern etched into his face. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't think so." Mark followed her gaze to Thomas's row. "He didn't do anything wrong," Mark said quietly. Emily's eyes widened. "You saw it too." "Hard not to," Mark replied. "I've been here long enough to recognize when the easy choice isn't the right one." Emily swallowed. "What do you do when the wrong choice is the one that keeps the lights on?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He looked older suddenly. "You decide what you can live with." The words settled between them heavy. Mr. Wallace shifted in his seat, pulling out his phone again. "No service." "Of course." He exhaled sharply. He hated being cut off. He hated not being able to narrate events in real time, to frame them as he saw fit. He stared ahead, jaw tight, replaying the exchange in his head, tweaking it, smoothing his role, sharpening Thomas's tone. By the time he was done, he was the reasonable one again. He didn't notice Linda Parker watching him, now her gaze steady assessing. She thought of her students again, of the way narratives were shaped by those who spoke first and loudest. She made a decision she'd been circling for hours. When the seatbelt sign flickered off once more, Linda stood, cane tapping softly against the aisle floor. She moved with care, stopping beside Thomas's row. He looked up, surprised. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty aisle seat across from him. "For a moment," Thomas said, standing slightly to give her room. She sat, exhaling. "I taught civics for 30 years, she said, without preamble. I told kids that systems only change when people refuse to accept what's easy." Thomas listened. "I didn't say anything earlier," Linda continued. "And I regret that. I don't know if it helps to say so now." "It helps," Thomas said. "More than you think." She studied him. "You're not just going to let this go?" "No," Thomas said simply. Linda nodded. "Good." They sat in silence for a moment, the shared understanding comfortable. Then Linda stood, patting his arm gently. "Whatever you're planning," she said, lowering her voice, "do it carefully. People don't like having mirrors held up to them." Thomas smiled. "I know." As she returned to her seat, Emily watched, heart pounding. The sense of inevitability grew a tide, pulling everything toward a shore she couldn't yet see. Thomas returned to his phone, opening the secure app once more. He added a new section to his notes. Witnesses, not names, descriptions, context. He described Linda, without identifying her, the quiet courage of delayed speech. He described Mark's hesitation, Emily's apology. He described Wallace's language, the supervisor's phrasing, the captain's intervention. He saved the file and locked the phone, tucking it away. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling rest. Some passengers complied. Others lay awake, thoughts restless. Outside, the night stretched on, endless and dark. In the cockpit, Jason Cole stared at the stars again, the earlier conversation looping in his mind. He wondered what his silence would cost him later. He wondered if there was still time to choose differently. Captain Hargreave leaned back, eyes half closed, confident once more. The aircraft was stable. The situation resolved. Tomorrow he would land, log the flight, move on. He had no idea that the calm he felt was borrowed. Thomas Reed closed his eyes not to sleep, but to rehearse. Not speeches, conversations, questions that forced answers. Paths that narrowed until accountability had nowhere left to hide. The plane cut through the darkness, steady, now carrying a cabin full of people who believed the worst had passed. It hadn't. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale grey light seeping through the oval windows as the aircraft descended through layered clouds. The cabin stirred slowly, the way people do when sleep has been shallow and thoughts heavy. Seat backs creaked upright. Tray tables clicked into place. Somewhere, a zipper hummed, then stopped. Thomas Reed watched the light change the faint reflection of his own face ghosted against the glass. He looked older in that light. Not weaker. Sharper. Like stone, worn smooth by years of pressure. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 25 minutes. Please ensure your seats are upright and your seatbelts fastened." Captain Hargreave's voice again. Calm, confident, unaware. Across the aisle, Mr. Wallace stretched, rubbing his neck irritation already settling in as the day's first companion. He hated mornings like this. Transitional. Disruptive. He glanced toward Thomas's row without meaning to, and then quickly looked away, annoyed with himself for the reflex. Emily moved down the aisle, collecting cups, her motions precise, rehearsed. She stopped briefly beside Thomas. "We'll be on the ground soon," she said, unnecessary information delivered out of habit. "I know," Thomas replied. Their eyes met again. This time she didn't look away first. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I hope you're okay." Thomas studied her face. The fear there wasn't for him. It was for herself, for what came after. He nodded. "So do I." She moved on, pulse racing. 2 rows back, Linda Parker sat upright, cane braced between her feet. She had not slept. She felt strangely alert, as if something important required her full attention. She watched Thomas from behind the set of his shoulders, the stillness of him, and wondered how many times in her life she'd mistaken quiet endurance for acceptance. In the cockpit, Jason Cole adjusted his harness, eyes flicking between the runway information and the horizon. "Weather's clear," he said. "Good," Hargreave replied. "Let's put this bird down." Jason hesitated, then spoke. "Sir, about earlier. The seating issue." Hargreave sighed. "You're still on that. I just want to make sure we documented it correctly." Hargreave's jaw tightened. It was customer service. No safety risk, nothing to document. Jason nodded, but the knot in his chest tightened. He thought of Linda's face when she'd passed the cockpit earlier, her eyes sharp, assessing. He thought of Thomas's voice. Calm. Certain. He wondered which version of the story would survive the landing. The wheels touched down with a muted thump, reverse thrust, roaring briefly before fading. The aircraft slowed, turning off the runway toward the gate. The cabin exhaled, the tension shifting, but not leaving. As the plane taxied, Thomas felt his phone vibrate once in his pocket. He didn't look at it. Not yet. Timing mattered. The aircraft came to a stop. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Almost immediately, phones appeared, in hands, screens, lighting faces as messages flooded in, people reconnecting to the world they'd been suspended from. Thomas stood calmly retrieving his bag. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. The aisle filled with bodies pressing forward, the usual choreography of impatience and entitlement. Wallace stood quickly, angling himself toward the front, as if proximity alone might preserve his advantage. "Excuse me," Wallace muttered, edging past a woman struggling with her overhead bag. Thomas stepped into the aisle at the same moment. Their paths intersected. For a brief second, Wallace looked directly at him. Truly looked, and something like recognition flickered. Not recognition of identity. Recognition of consequence. It passed quickly, replaced by irritation. "Watch it," Wallace said. Thomas smiled faintly. "Safe travels," he replied. Wallace scoffed and turned away, moving toward the door with renewed urgency. At the front of the cabin, the door opened. Cool morning air rushed in. Jet bridge secured. A uniformed ground agent appeared, clipboard in hand, posture formal. "Captain Hargreave," she said, looking past the line of passengers. "I'll need you and your first officer to remain on board for a moment after deplaning." Hargreave frowned. "What for?" She smiled politely. "Operational review." Jason's heart thudded. Hargreave bristled. "We're on a schedule." "Won't take long," the agent said. Passengers began to file out. Wallace paused, glancing back, impatience sharpening into concern as he noticed the ground agent's tone. He hesitated, then stepped forward again, choosing momentum over curiosity. Thomas exited last. Inside the terminal, the air felt different. Sharper, louder. Announcements echoed off high ceilings. Travelers surged in every direction. Thomas stepped aside, letting the flow pass him. He pulled out his phone and unlocked it. A single message sat at the top. From Margaret Ellis. "We're here." He looked up. Near the far wall of the gate area, a small cluster of people stood apart from the usual bustle. Two men in tailored suits, a woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, tablet tucked under her arm. Margaret Ellis met his gaze and inclined her head slightly. Thomas walked toward them. Margaret smiled when he reached her. "You look tired." "I am," Thomas said, "but not surprised." She nodded. "We received preliminary notes from an anonymous internal report. Timing aligns with what you described." "Anonymous?" Thomas repeated. Margaret's eyes flicked briefly toward the gate. "For now." Behind them, raised voices echoed. Wallace stood near the customer service desk, gesturing sharply. "I have a connection," he was saying. "I need to be rebooked immediately." The agent listened politely, typing, then glanced up. "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait a moment." "What for?" Wallace snapped. "For clarification," the agent replied. Wallace's face flushed. He turned, scanning the area, and his eyes landed on Thomas, standing with the suited group. Their gazes locked. The realization hit Wallace slowly, like a bruise blooming under skin. He took a step back, then another. "What is this?" he demanded, voice rising. Thomas did not respond. He didn't need to. Behind the gate door, Hargreave and Jason emerged, tension etched into their faces. The ground agent guided them toward the same group. Captain Hargreave. Margaret said, extending a hand. Margaret Ellis, we need to have a conversation. Hargreave hesitated, then shook her hand, his grip firm. About what? About conduct, Margaret said calmly. Policy. And what happens when discretion crosses into discrimination. Jason swallowed hard. Emily appeared then, standing near the gate, eyes wide as she took in the scene. She caught Thomas's eye again, her breath hitching. He nodded to her once, a small acknowledgement that made her chest tighten. Wallace pushed forward. This is ridiculous, he said. I haven't done anything wrong. Margaret turned to him, her expression cool. Sir, you'll be given an opportunity to share your perspective. But not right now. Who are you? Wallace demanded. Margaret held his gaze. Someone who listens when patterns repeat. Thomas felt the moment settle heavy and unavoidable. This was not the end. It wasn't even the climax. It was the point of no return. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and straightened the murmur of the terminal fading around him. The story everyone thought had ended on the plane had only just reached the part where it could no longer be ignored. The conference room overlooked the tarmac glass walls, turning the runway into a moving backdrop of engine service trucks and distant departures that no one inside was catching. The door closed with a muted click that sounded final in a way no one wanted to name. Thomas Reed took a seat at the far end of the table without being directed. He placed his bag beside the chair, folded his hands, and waited. The room filled around him in uneven silence. Margaret Ellis set her tablet down with deliberate care. Two airline legal representatives sat opposite jackets, still on eyes alert, already calculating. Captain Michael Hargreave remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, as if height could reassert something that had slipped. Jason Cole hovered near the door, unsure where he belonged. Wallace arrived last, escorted by a uniformed manager, whose expression suggested she had been briefed but not enlightened. Wallace's composure had not survived the walk from the gate. His face was flushed, his breathing shallow. He looked around the room, counting allies, finding none. "What is this?" Wallace demanded. "I have places to be." Margaret didn't look at him. "You'll be late." Wallace bristled. "I want names. I want explanations." "You'll get both," Margaret said, finally turning. "In that order." Hargreave cleared his throat. If this is about the earlier situation, it was resolved. The passenger complied. Thomas didn't move. Margaret's eyes returned to Hargreave. "Compliance doesn't resolve discrimination, Captain." Hargreave's jaw tightened. "With respect, you weren't on the aircraft. I've reviewed the preliminary record," Margaret said. "Audio, witness notes, crew statements, and a timeline that doesn't flatter anyone in this room." Jason shifted his weight, the floor seeming suddenly unreliable beneath him. One of the airline lawyers leaned forward. "We'd like to understand the basis for this meeting." Margaret tapped her tablet once. Pattern analysis. The airline's own data flagged multiple incidents over the last 5 years involving discretionary seat reassignments following vague complaints. Similar phrasing, similar outcomes, Similar demographics. Wallace scoffed. That's absurd. Margaret turned to him fully now. You use the phrase, "I don't feel comfortable." Correct? Wallace hesitated. I might have. You did, Margaret said. Multiple witnesses confirm it. So what Wallace snapped. Comfort matters. Thomas spoke, then quietly. Whose comfort? The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. Wallace pointed at Thomas. You're twisting this. I didn't say anything about race. You didn't have to, Thomas replied. His voice was steady, controlled. You invoked a system that knew what you meant. Hargreave bristled. This is getting out of hand. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Captain, you intervened using authority reserved for safety concerns. You addressed Mr. Reed with a diminutive term inconsistent with professional protocol. Do you dispute that Hargreave opened his mouth, then closed it? It wasn't meant that way. Intent is not the standard, Margaret said. Impact is. Jason swallowed. I heard it, he said. Suddenly, every head turned. Jason's heart pounded, but he kept going. I heard the language. I saw the passenger. He wasn't disruptive. I didn't think moving him was right. Hargreave stared at him. You should have said something. Jason met his gaze. I should have. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Wallace looked between them, his certainty cracking. This is insane, Wallace said. You're making a federal case out of a seat. Margaret's expression hardened. No. We're addressing how power is exercised when it believes it won't be questioned. Thomas leaned forward slightly. I didn't come here to punish anyone for discomfort, he said. I came here because systems don't change when incidents are dismissed as misunderstandings. One of the lawyers glanced at Thomas, recognition dawning too late. Mr. Reed, he said carefully. Your name came up in a separate context. Would you like to clarify your role here? Thomas considered him. I would. He reached into his jacket and removed his phone, placing it face down on the table. I'm not here as a complainant, he said. I'm here as a stakeholder. Margaret nodded. Thomas Reed is the majority voting trustee of Meridian Group Holdings. The name landed differently. One of the lawyers stiffened. Another's pen paused mid-note. And Meridian. Margaret finalized its acquisition of a controlling interest in this airline at 6:18 this morning. Hargreave's face drained of color. Wallace stared, uncomprehending. That's not possible. It is, Margaret said. The filings are complete. Jason felt something in his chest loosen, replaced by awe and a flicker of dread. Thomas didn't smile. I didn't buy an airline because of a seat, he said. I confirmed a decision because of a pattern. Wallace pushed back from the table. You can't do this. This is retaliation. Thomas looked at him. No, this is governance. Margaret slid a document across the table toward Hargreave. Effective immediately pending formal review. Captain Michael Hargreave is relieved of duty. Hargreave stood abruptly. You don't have that authority. I do, Thomas said. Through the board. Hargreave's mouth worked soundlessly. He sat. Another document slid towards the door, toward Jason. First Officer Jason Cole is placed on administrative leave with full pay, pending ethics review and training, Margaret said. Your cooperation is noted. Jason nodded, tears threatening. Thank you. Margaret turned to Wallace. As for you, sir, your loyalty status is suspended pending investigation. Your conduct is under review by the airline and external regulators. Wallace's voice broke. You're ruining me. Thomas shook his head once. You're experiencing consequences. Emily appeared at the doorway, summoned quietly. She froze when she saw Thomas at the table. Margaret gestured her in. Emily Harris, she said. You'll be interviewed. For now, you're reassigned off flight duty with pay. Emily nodded, breathless. I understand. Thomas met her eyes. You apologized, he said. That matters. She exhaled shakily. Margaret gathered her tablet. This meeting is adjourned. There will be follow-up. As chairs scraped and people stood, Thomas remained seated for a moment longer. He watched Wallace leave in silence. He watched Hargreave walk stiffly toward the door, shoulders heavy with something like disbelief. He watched Jason pause, then turn back, meeting Thomas's gaze. I'm sorry, Jason said. Thomas nodded. Do better, he replied. You will. When the room emptied, Thomas stood and looked out through the glass at the runway, at planes lifting into the morning sky. He felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that something irreversible had occurred. Margaret joined him. This won't be clean, she said. There will be noise. I know, Thomas said. Let it be loud. Outside, an aircraft roared down the runway and lifted free of the ground, leaving behind a wake of heat and sound that lingered long after it passed. The news didn't break all at once. It leaked. A line here, a whisper there. An internal memo forwarded to the wrong inbox. A status update paused, reconsidered, then posted anyway. By noon, the airport buzzed with it, a low-frequency hum of speculation vibrating through terminals and offices alike. Thomas Reed watched it unfold from a quiet corner of the executive lounge that still smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. He hadn't changed clothes. He hadn't needed to. The weight of the morning sat on him like a second coat, heavier than anything he wore. Across the glass planes came and went their movements precise, indifferent. Systems working exactly as designed. He wondered how many people believed that about the system he had just touched. Margaret Ellis joined him without announcement, placing a folder on the table between them. First wave is live, she said. Internal review notice, temporary duty changes, compliance audit. Nothing public yet. Thomas nodded. They'll feel it anyway. They already do, Margaret said. Phones are ringing. Thomas glanced at the folder, but didn't open it. He already knew what was inside. He had read versions of it before. Patterns, language, risk mitigation dressed up as neutrality. You okay? Margaret asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. I'm clear. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. But it's enough. On the other side of the terminal, Emily Harris sat alone in a break room that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Her uniform hung neatly on a hook, untouched. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Another co-worker asking what had happened. Another friend asking if the rumors were true. She didn't respond. She replayed the meeting in her head, Thomas's voice when he said that her apology mattered. No one had ever told her that before. Apologies were supposed to be private, small, forgettable, not something that counted. Her hands trembled as she poured herself water. She wondered what came next. She wondered if doing the right thing ever stopped feeling like standing at the edge of a cliff. Down the hall, Jason Cole sat stiffly in a chair outside an office he'd never been inside before. Administrative leave. The words echoed hollow and strange. He wasn't fired. He wasn't cleared. He existed in a space between where intentions were weighed and silence carried consequences. He thought about calling his wife. He didn't know what to say. When Captain Hargreave exited the building through a side door, he didn't look back. His walk was rigid, each step a refusal to process what had happened. 35 years. He had done everything right, or so he told himself. He had followed procedure. He had maintained order. He reached his car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The quiet pressed in. For the first time, he wondered if the authority he'd relied on had been thinner than he'd believed. Mr. Wallace's driver waited at the curb, engine idling. Wallace slid into the back seat, hands clenched. His phone buzzed incessantly now. Messages from his assistant, his broker, a board member asking what the hell he'd done. "This is a misunderstanding," Wallace said aloud, as if the words could anchor him. "This will blow over." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He had always understood consequences as something that happened to other people. Back in the lounge, Thomas finally opened the folder Margaret had brought. He skimmed the first page, then closed it again. "This part," he said, tapping the cover. "It's just the beginning." Margaret nodded. "You're going to be accused of making an example." "I am making an example," Thomas said. "Of accountability." Margaret studied him. "You're aware this will cost you goodwill." Thomas smiled faintly. "Goodwill that depends on silence isn't worth keeping." A junior executive approached hesitantly, stopping a few feet away. "Mr. Reed," she said. "The board would like a statement. Just something internal. Reassurance." Thomas looked at her. Really looked. She was young, capable, nervous. The kind of person who had learned early how to navigate power without disturbing it. "Tell them this," Thomas said. "We are not changing who we are. We are revealing it." She nodded, scribbling, then hurried away. Margaret leaned back. "You know they'll try to narrow this. Call it an isolated incident." "They can try," Thomas said, "but isolation only works when there's nothing to connect." He stood, stretching slightly, joints, protesting the long hours. "I want the audit expanded." Margaret raised an eyebrow. To what extent language patterns? Complaint outcomes. Who gets moved? Who gets believed? 5 years back. That's going to uncover things people worked hard to bury. "Good," Thomas said. "Let's stop pretending they're buried." In the terminal, Linda Parker stood near the windows, watching planes lift off. She had missed her connection. She didn't care. She felt strangely lighter, as if the apology she'd given had loosened something she'd been carrying for years. Her phone buzzed. A former student, now a lawyer, had sent a message. "Saw something on the news. Was that you at the airport?" Linda smiled. She typed back slowly. "I was there." In the break room, Emily finally answered a message. Just one. From her sister. "Are you okay?" Emily stared at the screen. then typed. "I don't know. But I think I did the right thing." She sent it before she could overthink it. Jason stood as a door opened and a representative stepped out, clipboard in hand. "We'll be in touch," she said kindly. "This isn't the end of your career." Jason nodded, throat tight. "I hope not," she hesitated. "It's the beginning of a different one." He let that sit with him. Thomas walked out of the lounge and into the flow of the terminal unescorted. People glanced at him, some recognizing his face now, others just sensing the gravity he carried. He didn't mind. Visibility had its uses. As he passed a bank of televisions, a headline scrolled across the bottom of one screen. "Airline announces internal review after passenger incident." No names, no details. Yet. Thomas stopped for a moment, watching travelers watch the screen. He saw the questions forming, the narratives assembling. He knew how this would go. He knew how loud it would get. He also knew this was bigger than him. Margaret caught up, falling into step beside him. "Last chance to soften it," she said quietly. Thomas shook his head. "Soft is how we got here." They walked together toward the exit, the noise of the terminal swelling around them. Outside, the sky was clear blue and unremarkable. A good day for departures. Thomas paused at the doors, taking one last look back at the machinery of movement, at the system humming along, already adjusting to the disturbance. He stepped outside. Behind him, the story continued to spread, not as a single explosion, but as a series of unavoidable reckonings, each one forcing someone somewhere to decide whether comfort was worth the cost. Thomas didn't look back again. The first camera appeared before noon, set up across the street from the corporate headquarters, its operator pretending to adjust focus while waiting for someone important to walk through the glass doors. By mid-afternoon, there were 3. By evening, the sidewalk had acquired the low, restless energy of a place where answers were expected to emerge. Thomas Reed watched the footage later alone in his office, sound muted. He recognized the posture of the reporters, the way their bodies leaned forward, hungry for a frame that could simplify what had happened into something easily consumed. He didn't blame them. Stories needed shapes. Villains, heroes, endings. This one refused to cooperate. Inside the building, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations stopped when he passed, then resumed quieter. Polite nods replaced casual greetings. People were recalibrating, trying to determine where the invisible lines now sat. Authority had a way of doing that, especially when it arrived without warning. Thomas closed his laptop and leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. He thought of his mother, of the way she used to watch the evening news, with the sound low reading captions instead. "They leave out what matters," she'd say. "Always have." His phone vibrated. Margaret's name flashed on the screen. He answered without greeting. "They're pushing," she said. "Board members, donors, a few friendly senators." Thomas exhaled slowly. About optics," Margaret replied. "About timing, about whether this needed to be so public." Thomas smiled faintly. It wasn't public until they made it public. Margaret didn't argue. "They want a statement, a personal one. From you. They already have the facts. They want reassurance," she said. "They're afraid of momentum." Thomas closed his eyes. Momentum frightened people who had grown comfortable with stasis. "I'll speak," he said finally. "But not the way they want." There was a pause on the other end. Then Margaret said, "I figured." Across town, in a quiet townhouse with too many framed photos and not enough warmth, Wallace sat at his dining table legal pad covered in scribbles that went nowhere. His attorney stood near the window, arms crossed, expression grim. "You need to stop talking," the attorney said. "To anyone, including me, unless I ask a question." Wallace scoffed. "They're painting me like some kind of monster." "They're painting a system," the attorney replied. "You happened to be standing in it." Wallace pushed his chair back. "I didn't do anything illegal. That's not the standard," the attorney said, "and you know it." Wallace stared at the wall at a photograph of himself shaking hands with a governor years ago. He had always believed proximity to power was protection. He was beginning to understand how conditional that belief was. At the same hour, Emily Harris sat on her couch laptop open, staring at a draft email she had rewritten a dozen times. Resignation, appeal, explanation. She didn't know which she was supposed to send. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mark. "You're not alone." She swallowed hard. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it steadied her. In another part of the city, Jason Cole sat at his kitchen table, paperwork spread out before him. Training modules, ethics review forms, a future uncertain but not destroyed. He thought of the moment he'd spoken up, how his voice had trembled and then steadied. He realized something then that surprised him. He didn't regret it. The next morning, Thomas stood in a small studio with no backdrop, no logo visible. Just a chair, a camera, and a single light adjusted to avoid drama. He wore the same charcoal jacket from the flight. He hadn't planned it that way. It simply felt honest. The producer gave a quiet cue. The red light blinked on. Thomas looked directly into the lens. He didn't smile. "I'm not here to talk about a seat," he began. His voice was even measured, carrying weight without strain. "I'm here to talk about decisions, about how often we confuse convenience with correctness, and how systems learn from what we allow." He paused, letting the silence work. On a flight this week, a decision was made to move a passenger because someone else felt uncomfortable. No rules were broken. No safety issue existed. But a message was sent, not just to that passenger, but to everyone watching. He leaned forward slightly. That message said some people are easier to move than others. Some discomfort matters more. The camera held him steady. "I don't believe in public shaming," Thomas continued. "I believe in accountability. And accountability doesn't end when a situation becomes awkward." He spoke for 6 minutes. Not long. Long enough. When the light went off, the producer exhaled. That was clear. Thomas nodded. Clarity was the point. The clip went live within the hour. It spread faster than anyone predicted, not because it was explosive, but because it was calm, because it named things people recognized, but rarely heard articulated without anger or apology. By evening, the headlines shifted, less about the incident, more about the pattern, or about the former employees began to speak cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Stories surfaced, similar phrases, similar outcomes, a mosaic forming from fragments long dismissed as coincidence. Margaret called again. "You opened a door." Thomas watched the city lights flicker on outside his office window. Doors don't open themselves. Inside the airline, The audit expanded, language flagged, procedures rewritten, training accelerated, resistance surfaced too. Quiet complaints about overreach, about political correctness, about how things used to be simpler. Thomas read them all. He didn't respond. In the break room, Emily watched the video on her phone, tears blurring the screen. She hadn't expected to see herself in it, not directly. But she recognized the moment Thomas described. She felt for the first time that the weight she'd been carrying had a name. She closed the laptop and began typing again, her message steadier now. In his townhouse, Wallace watched the clip in silence. He replayed it once, twice. He didn't recognize himself in Thomas's words. That frightened him more than if he had. He turned off the television and sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. Late that night, Linda Parker sat at her desk pen, moving across paper as she wrote a letter she'd been meaning to write for years. Not to a paper, to her grandchildren, about the day she stayed quiet and the day she didn't. About how courage wasn't a trait you had, but a choice you made again and again, sometimes late but still in time. Thomas remained in his office long after the building emptied. He stood by the window, watching the reflection of himself overlay the city below. He felt the strain now, the cost. He welcomed it. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from Margaret. "Brace yourself. Tomorrow gets louder." Thomas typed back. Good. He turned off the lights and stepped into the hallway, the quiet echoing around him. Somewhere, systems were shifting, grinding, resisting. Somewhere, someone was deciding whether to speak, to stay silent, to move, or to stand. Thomas walked on, knowing this chapter was closing, and the next would demand even more than the last. The subpoena arrived before sunrise, slid under the door of the airline's legal department, with the quiet inevitability of weather. By the time the city woke, phones were already vibrating with it, the word itself carrying a gravity that stripped excuses bare. Thomas Reed read the message standing in his kitchen, coffee cooling untouched on the counter. He didn't smile. He didn't tense. He read it once, then again, letting the implications settle. Oversight Committee. Depositions. Documents. A widening lens. He typed a single reply to Margaret. We proceed. Across town, the airline's executive floor buzzed with a brittle energy that made every step sound louder than it should. People spoke in lowered voices, as if volume could summon consequences faster. A compliance officer stared at a wall of screens, red flags multiplying like bruises. A senior vice president rubbed his temples and wondered how a single flight had cracked open years of habits. In a smaller office near the back, Emily Harris sat across from a human resources representative who kept her hands folded. Voice careful. This isn't disciplinary, the representative said. It's procedural. Emily nodded, listening. She had learned the language now. Procedural meant uncertain. It meant being weighed by forces larger than any one person. You're protected, the representative added. Whistleblower provisions. Emily breathed out slowly. Protected didn't mean safe, but it meant seen. Jason Cole sat at his kitchen table again this time, with a suit jacket draped over the chair. He was due downtown in 2 hours. Statement. Timeline. The words felt heavier than the fabric on his shoulders. He rehearsed answers aloud, stopping when they sounded too polished. He wanted the truth to sound like the truth, uneven, human. Captain Hargreave stood in his garage, staring at a box of flight manuals he hadn't touched in years. The smell of oil and dust pressed in. He thought about calling an old friend, someone who might say this was unfair, that the world had changed too fast. He didn't make the call. He wasn't sure what he wanted to hear. Mr. Wallace woke to a headline pushed to his phone by an algorithm that no longer cared about his comfort. Former airline passenger under review as federal inquiry expands. His name wasn't in the title. It didn't need to be. He scrolled until he found it anyway, buried but unmistakable. He set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the silence roaring. Downtown, the hearing room filled slowly. Wood-paneled walls, microphones arranged with indifferent precision, the seal on the wall glinting under fluorescent lights. Thomas arrived early, alone. He chose a seat without ceremony and placed his folder on the table. Inside were copies of everything he'd already provided, and nothing he hadn't. Margaret took a seat beside him, close enough to signal alignment, far enough to preserve independence. "They'll try to pull you into a narrative," she said quietly. "Resist the frame." Thomas nodded. "I'll answer what they ask." And when they ask why now, Thomas looked straight ahead. "I'll tell them the truth." The room filled. Staffers, counsel, observers, a few reporters permitted to watch, pens poised. The chair gavels the session to order. Formalities, oaths, the language of process wrapping the moment in ritual. A senator leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Reed, you're here as a private citizen and a corporate stakeholder." "Do you understand?" "I do," Thomas said. "Do you allege that the airline engaged in discriminatory practices?" "I allege that discretion was applied in a way that produced discriminatory outcomes," Thomas replied. Repeatedly. A murmur rippled. The senator raised an eyebrow. "That's a careful distinction. It's an accurate one," Thomas said. "Systems don't need malicious intent to cause harm. They need permission." Another voice cut in. "Are you saying this incident justified executive-level intervention?" "I'm saying the incident revealed a pattern that justified scrutiny," Thomas said. "Intervention followed the evidence." "Some would argue this is an overreaction." Thomas turned slightly, meeting the speaker's gaze. "Some would argue comfort is worth more than dignity. They've been arguing that for a long time." The questions continued, measured, probing, occasionally sharp. Thomas answered without flourish. He did not raise his voice. He did not generalize. He described decisions, language outcomes. He refused hypotheticals. He returned again and again to the same point. Accountability is cumulative. In the gallery, Linda Parker watched hands folded in her lap. She recognized the rhythm of civic process, the slow grind that students found boring, and she had always found essential. She felt a quiet pride she didn't fully understand. When Jason was called, his voice wavered at first, then steadied. He described what he'd seen, what he'd heard, what he'd failed to do. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't indict others. He told the truth as best he could. The chair thanked him. The word landed like a small absolution. Emily's testimony came next, remote, her face framed by a simple background. She spoke of training modules that emphasized de-escalation, but never defined equity. of phrases that floated through briefings without challenge, of the moment she realized compliance could be complicit. Her hands shook. She kept going. Hargreave declined to answer certain questions on advice of counsel. The room noted it. Wallace did the same, his jaw-set eyes fixed somewhere far away. By afternoon, the hearing recessed. No conclusions, no verdicts, just a record made public and impossible to retract. Outside, cameras waited. Thomas stepped into the light without stopping. He didn't offer a statement. He didn't need to. The questions chased him anyway. He walked through them, the noise washing over him like rain. In the days that followed, the effects spread outward, policies revised, trainings redesigned, a few resignations, a few promotions delayed. Not revolution. Recalibration. The backlash arrived too. Opinion pieces accusing Thomas of virtue signaling, of weaponizing ownership, of stirring division. He read them. He let them pass. He had learned long ago that criticism often mistook discomfort for damage. One evening, as the city settled into a restless calm, Thomas sat alone in his office lights low. He listened to a voicemail from his sister, her voice warm and worried. "You okay?" she asked. Mom would be proud. He closed his eyes just for a moment. Across town, Emily sent her email. Not a resignation, a commitment to stay, to push, to help write the new training. She hit send before fear could intervene. Jason received notice of his reinstatement conditional, accompanied by a note recommending him for an ethics working group. He stared at it for a long time, then laughed once, a sound halfway to a sob. Hargreave packed his manuals into a box he labeled with careful handwriting. He didn't know what came next. He knew only that the old certainty was gone. Wallace's attorney called late voice tight. "We need to prepare." Wallace hung up and sat in the dark, thinking of a sentence he'd used casually and how far it had traveled. Thomas stood at the window again, city lights shimmering like scattered answers. He felt the weight now fully. The cost, the responsibility. He accepted it. His phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. "The committee wants follow-ups. This isn't over." Thomas typed back. "It never is." He turned off the lamp and let the room go dark, the reflection of the city lingering on the glass. Outside, the system continued its slow adjustment gears, grinding against resistance, moving at last in a direction that could not be easily reversed. The first elevation flight departed on a clear morning. The sky stretched wide and pale blue, like a promise that didn't need decoration. Thomas Reed boarded without cameras, without aids, just a leather briefcase worn soft at the handle, and the steady gait of a man who had learned to carry consequence without spectacle. The cabin felt different, not redesigned, not rebranded in ways that begged to be noticed, just quieter. The kind of quiet that comes when people are paying attention. In the forward cabin, no one hovered. No one stared. The crew moved with an ease that hadn't been trained into them yet, only invited. A senior attendant with silver hair, tucked neatly back, paused when she saw Thomas, offered a nod that wasn't rehearsed. Respect without fear. He returned it. Seat 1. A was occupied. Not by him. A man in his early 70s sat there, posture slightly stooped, hands folded over a frayed paperback. His jacket was modest navy wool cuffs, showing decades of careful wear. When he looked up, his eyes were sharp, curious, the kind that had spent a lifetime watching systems move without ever being allowed to steer them. Thomas stopped. For a moment, the cabin held its breath. The man smiled first. They told me this seat was reserved for people who kept showing up even when no one noticed. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. They told you right. The man chuckled softly. I drove buses in Cleveland for 40 years. Night routes, snow routes, the ones nobody wanted. Figured I'd done enough sitting up front without being asked. Thomas shook his head once, slow. You did more than enough. He moved on, settled into his assigned seat, a few rows back. The same one he had chosen this time. Not as a statement, as a decision. As the aircraft pushed back, the city slid away with familiar reluctance. The engines built, not roaring, just confident. Thomas closed his eyes not to rest, but to listen. To the small sounds, the click of seatbelts, the murmur of pages turning, the rhythm of people existing without being measured. Emily passed through the aisle, her uniform the same, but her posture different. She caught Thomas's eye, hesitated, then spoke. We start the first training next week. Real one. Facilitated. In person. Good, Thomas said. She nodded. I'm glad I stayed. So am I. Further back, Jason sat alone, reading over notes he had written and rewritten. He wasn't sure what his future looked like yet, but he knew what he would not be silent about again. That was enough for now. In the cockpit, a new captain ran through checks with deliberate calm. His voice carried none of the old sharpness, just clarity. As the plane lifted, sunlight poured through the windows, filling the cabin with a soft gold that felt earned. Thomas watched the ground fall away, thought of the hearings, the arguments, the names that had been written down and would never quite come off the page. He thought of the people who had lost jobs, the ones who had gained resolve, the ones still deciding which way they would turn next time. Justice, he knew now, didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like maintenance, repetitive, uncelebrated, necessary. The flight leveled. Drinks were served. The bus driver in 1A opened his book, again settled deeper into the seat, belonging there without needing permission. Thomas leaned back, hands resting on the armrests, the hum of the aircraft steady beneath him. He thought of his father's voice, long gone, but never quiet, reminding him that power unused was just potential rotting in the dark. He had used it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but deliberately. Outside clouds drifted past, indifferent and endless. Inside something had shifted. Not the end of anything. The beginning of a standard. The attendant returned with water. On the napkin, a small note written in careful ink. Thank you for changing the rules, instead of just the seats. Thomas folded it, once slipped it into his pocket, and looked forward as the plane carried them all onward. Ordinary people inside an extraordinary moment that refused to announce itself. If this story meant something to you, if you felt the weight of it settle where it needed to, like the flight subscribe, and comment these 3 words. Dignity has consequences.